Hey guys, got a very instructive game to share with you just now. I just got a challenge from a new chess.com friend, Let's Mate out in Jamaica. Challenged me to a 10-minute rapid game, and I'll take you through it. It's very, very instructive. So he starts with e4, and I decide to reply with e5 on this occasion. And now he plays bishop to c4, so it's the bishop's opening. And so clearly the bishop's looking down at f7, and I reply with knight to f6. So I've got to be aware of this knight coming out potentially to here. But I've got time to block it at this point. And now pawn to d3, bring my other knight out, knight to f3 comes out, and now I strike in the middle. This is a move that you need to remember when there's a risk of this kind of attack, because the pawn is actually defended twice by your knight and your queen. So obviously I'm threatening the bishop. So pawn takes, and now knight takes. And my opponent castles, and now I bring out my light squared bishop to where it's defended by the pawn there, and it's just adding an extra defense to the knight, allowing my queen to move if it wants to. Now the knight comes out, and I notice here that there is a tactic. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and destroy my opponent's pawn structure in the next two moves. Well, first I bring my bishop out where it's allowing my king to castle if need be, and also in line with opponent's king. Now the rook comes out. Now check this out. So I capture knight takes knight on c3, and pawn takes is the only real response. And in my next move I capture his bishop. Now, in fact, and clearly he really needs to recapture with the pawn. Now what he's got is this horrible structure, tripled pawns, tripled and isolated pawns on the c-file. Now, thinking back, actually what he should probably have done to avoid this situation is done an in-between move. So I think that if he'd have captured my bishop on the next move, what could I have done? In fact, I'd have captured his queen, so there you go. Yeah, that's absolutely forced. Bishop takes, and then pawn takes, and he's got this very, very nasty pawn structure. And from this point in the game, I'm well ahead. So we exchange queens, because I figure I've got this wonderful positional strength here with my opponent's pawn structure being so bad. And I castle. Rook comes across, adding a second attacker to this pawn. So I slide my rook over to e8 to defend. Knight comes in, and I kick the knight. So the knight retreats now to there. And I figure that I can drop my bishop back safely to b6. I'm not really concerned about this move, which is what my opponent plays, because I know I can go to a5. And this pawn's now pinned, because if it moves, I can capture the rook. So the bishop comes round. And now I start to push my pawns up the king's side. Rook comes across to attack the undefended pawn on b7. So again, I just slide my rook over. And now the bishop comes in with ideas to exchange. So instead of that, I defend my bishop with a pawn. Because clearly I don't want to take his bishop and give him the chance to improve his pawn structure. I want to keep it that way. So I push my pawn forward, he takes my bishop, and I recapture with a knight. Pawn takes, and now pawn takes. And I'm in a really commanding position now. Material is, I think, equal, but my structure, my pawn structure is so much better. Rook comes out, knight attacks rook, rook slides over. And there's quite an obvious tactic here, which would be knight takes f6, because its defender, the pawn on g7, is pinned to the king. So that would be a really, really good move if you can do that, because it comes with check and a fork on the rook as well. So I simply move my king out the way, which breaks the pin, and now it means that rook can't capture the pawn, knight can't capture the pawn, and I'm okay. The other rook comes across, and I meet it with rook b to d8. My opponent, quite rightly, doesn't want to exchange rooks at this point, because he's weaker. Now I bring my knight round to attack the loose pawn on c2, rook comes across, and now I look to double my pawns on the open file. He beats me to it. Now, again, I don't want to exchange because it would undouble these pawns, and these pawns are really going to be a burden to my opponent for the rest of the game. So I double my rooks and we swap off one pair of rooks, and right now I'm feeling very happy. He moves his knight across and I bring in my rooks, and now I've got 2 pieces now looking at this pawn, and I've got the option to go a pawn up. Now with this move, knight to e4, he's attacking my rook, so I mean my intention was that to capture with the knight, keeping the rooks on the board, but with that move, so I mean I could have gone a pawn up now. I could have grabbed the rook, maybe swapped off rooks, and I should have been in a good position to go on and win the game. I've got a pawn majority on this side now with the e-pawn that my opponent doesn't have, and then it would be 2 pawns against 2 pawns, and I should have been able to close out the win with that. But instead I decide to drop my rook back and renew my kind of threats. So I've kept his pawns the way they are. I can now, keep just manoeuvring my pieces around to try and snatch an extra pawn. Now he brings his king in, good idea. And now I'm threatening knight to d2 with a fork, which would force the exchange of knights, only benefit me. But he brings his king in again, preventing that idea. So now I decide to kick his knight away. First I calculated which squares he could and couldn't go to. So he's pretty much forced back now to g3. Now I start to bring my king into the centre. We're in the end game, so kings like to be central. Rook comes across and I decide to swap off rooks. Because although material is actually equal, these 2 pawns are going to prove a real pain for my opponent. Now this is the point now where I'm thinking this is just a case of closing out the game. I am a little bit down on time, down to 2 minutes on the clock, but I really should have been able to just put this game to bed. So I come round to attack the pawn, king comes back in. He's done a good job now of centralising his king. I bring my pawn up, he brings his knight back, and I'm just pressing up with my pawns now. Now, important point in the game, I've got the opportunity either to capture with the knight or the pawn. So I decide to capture with the pawn, knight takes, king takes, king to d6. Now at this point I still should be winning, okay? But with 1 minute 18 on the clock, I now pretty much blunder. So he pushes his c-pawn and I move my king across, because obviously white's best hope right now is to promote this a-pawn, and I don't want to allow that. However, I have this majority on the E and F files. So all I really need to do is get my e-pawn to here, and if my opponent captures and I recapture with a pawn, I should be able to go on to promote and win the game. And I can do all of that in the time it takes this pawn to come down the board. But instead of that, I push my king across. And now the pawn jumps forwards, and now I start my push on the e. And now I continue and then take. Okay? Now at this point in time, I think the game should be pretty much won, because I am 2 jumps away from converting my pawn and promoting my pawn. But the thing that you have to bear in mind is, if you draw a square from where your pawn is to the end of the board, okay, and the square has to contain your pawn and be the same, obviously, size on each side. If your opponent can enter that square with his king, he can stop your pawn, and he can. So his king goes in. Now I move across, king goes to there, and I decide, let's push the pawn anyway and keep the king 1 square away, and he captures. So now he's actually 1 pawn up. I move my king across, I grab his pawn. Now his king comes back in opposition to my king, so opposition means that your kings are 2 squares apart on the same rank or file. Now, because of that, kings have this force field all the way around them, and I now I can't get close to his pawn, and I can't defend my pawn. So now the situation is completely winning for white. and there's really nothing I can do. And now with he plays a good ending. He gets his king in front of his pawn, and from this point now, there is no way that I can stop that pawn from converting. So my only hope now is to win on time, but I'm a minute down. It's just not going to happen. So this is really interesting that if we go back, let's go back to here. This is one of the critical moments. All I need to do at this point is to push this pawn across, right? But instead, I think just slightly defensively, slightly too conservatively, and I end up going down in material. So his pawn comes up, and I'm too late now with this push. Push, push, and then we have the square, and the king can enter. And I think I've pretty much already lost this game now. So what should have happened? Let's say from here, let's play it through a different way. So he goes there, 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 takes. Now his king would have to advance up there, right? Let's say takes. Do we have the same situation? Yeah, now his king can go in there. Yeah, it's pretty tricky one. Don't know how I could have converted this advantage. So the big difference is this a pawn. I've left that a pawn on the board. Yeah, this is one that I will have to analyse maybe a bit further. But to go from this massive advantage of having these horrible double pawns, it's just simply good positional play for my opponent. He's got his king involved in the game quicker than I did. And there's really no... Because the thing about these pawns is, he has to get rid of this double pawn structure. So if I'd have, say, just put my pawn here on b5, maybe reinforced it with that one, brought my king in as security, there's nothing he can do. If this pawn comes up, I simply snatch it off, and then I've got a free path to promotion. So, yeah, an embarrassing loss in many ways, because this game was completely winning for black, and so dominant that it just goes to show how easy it is to take your foot off the gas. And you need to be brutal in your endings. You need to think, okay, what do I have to do, A, to prevent my opponent from having any chance of winning, which is vital, and B, to make sure that I win this game and convert this game. And I think the answer is there. For as long as I leave these pawns the way they are, my opponent's in trouble, right? But here, maybe I should have just pushed to b4 there, right? So then his king is tied to the defense of this pawn. What can he do now? His king can't advance here or here, right? He maybe push a pawn. The one downside is that my knight is actually trapped here. So I can't go there because of his knight, and I can't go there because there's two defenders on that. But I don't know, maybe... Yeah, he's kind of got my knight trapped at that point, so I am a little bit, constrained with two attackers on there. So, yeah, I think by that point it was already a tricky situation for me. I think moving my knight over to the edge of the board was probably, again, not a good idea. Maybe pawn to there would have been fine. Maybe bring my knight back. Try and swap off the knights. Because there's, my pawn advantage in the middle here should have been something that I could have converted, but on this occasion I didn't. Well played to my opponent. He got himself in a horrible position early on in the game with those exchanges leading to tripled and isolated pawns, and just a good lesson for me to make absolutely sure that I convert an advantage like that. So you live and learn. Okay, hope this has been instructive for you as well. I'll see you soon.